Welcome to Episode 7. What exactly do the heavens declare? Humans have always been fascinated by the heavens. In this episode, we will talk about astronomy. Ancient civilizations built monuments coinciding with astronomical events, and there are many references to stars in the heavens in the Bible. Stonehenge and Machu Picchu are examples of these monuments, and there are many more around the world. We will talk about ancient man in another episode, but today we will talk about how astronomy is relevant to young Earth creation. First, I will talk about some observations and how they align with the biblical creation model. Because they align with the biblical creation model, they contradict the secular model. In this case, the secular model will be the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is the mainstream model for the creation of the universe. However, their expectations don't always end up being reality. If the Big Bang Theory were true, there are certain things that we'd expect to see, or not see, today. Perhaps you recognize the phrase, heavens declare, from Psalm 19:1. Psalm 19:1 reads, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament sheweth his handiwork." So, let's get started. What exactly do the heavens declare? And what is God's handiwork? Let's start with comets. Comets are a relatively small, frozen ball of gases, rock, and dust that orbit around the sun. The length of a comet's orbit varies greatly. Some may even take thousands of years to complete their orbit. However, some are a lot less than that. Comets that take less than 200 years to complete their orbit are classified short-period comets. When comets pass by the sun, they lose some of their mass. This is because the sun is large and hot, and comets are small and frozen. So this is to be expected. So at some point, one would expect that if every time a comet passes by the sun, it gets smaller, eventually it would be completely destroyed. According to the secular scientists, comets are left over from the formation of the universe. But also according to the secular scientists, the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years old. This raises a question. How does a comet that passes by the sun every 200 years for 13.7 billion years still exist? Really, the question could be, why do we even see comets at all? 13.7 billion years is a long time. Simply by the fact that they exist, the maximum age of some of these short-period comets cannot be much more than a few million years. One can conclude that if the things from the start of the universe that we can observe today are relatively young, maybe the universe is relatively young as well. Kind of like what the Bible says. The secular scientists won't have this, though. So fortunately, they have proposed theories to account for this difficulty. The only problem is, there isn't really any clear evidence that their theories are true. They claim that there are two regions within our solar system that essentially have an endless supply of comets. For the short-period comets, they say they come from something called the Kuiper Belt. Then they say the long-period comets come from something called the Oort cloud. However, it is not clear that we have actually been able to see any comets in the Kuiper Belt, and there is no observational evidence for the Oort cloud. Their theories essentially are, since comets are young and the universe is old, there must be some endless supply of comets out there. But like I said, there isn't actually any observational evidence for this endless supply. So for now, the secular scientists believe these theories without any evidence, because they just know that the universe is old. Therefore, they interpret observations to fit that conclusion. I think the inconclusiveness of the Oort cloud and Kuiper Belt theories is reflected by this statement on the NASA webpage about the Kuiper Belt. Quote, "Both the Oort cloud and the Kuiper Belt are thought to be sources of comets." End quote. Just because they're thought to be doesn't mean they are. Maybe they'll find out someday. One advantage that I think creation scientists have is that if there's just one thing on the Earth or in space that can be proven to be younger than the age of the Earth or the age of the universe, it would instantly collapse all of the theories that the secular scientists ever had about old Earth or old universe. That something could be like a comet. If one comet can be proven to be younger than 13.7 billion years, then the universe isn't 13.7 billion years old. As I mentioned before, the mere existence of some comets pretty much suggests that they are younger than 13.7 billion years. The evolutionists, on the other hand, have to thoroughly explain every observed phenomenon in accordance to their theories, which is what they do. Except as we have been finding out, there isn't always evidence for their theories. But evidence that contradicts preconceived ideas isn't always relevant for religious individuals. Next, we will move on to stars. Some stars that are observed in outer space have rings or disks of dust and gas around them. What dust, or space dust, refers to is small particles of rocks, ice, minerals, or organic compounds. These stars are allegedly millions of years old. However, similar to comets, if these stars that are really hot are millions of years old, why hasn't this dust and gas evaporated? It should have dissipated or vaporized by now. According to this article from Answers in Genesis, the secular scientists are kind of just like, well, it's the way it is. They don't really give a clear explanation of how the existence of this dust is possible. They come up with some theories, of course, but there is no real way to observe if these theories are true, because the stars formed before we were able to observe them. The next issue is spiral galaxies. The galaxy that our solar system is in, the Milky Way, is proposed to be a spiral galaxy. What makes a galaxy spiral is the objects closer in the center rotate faster than the objects farther away from the center. To encapsulate this topic, I will read two quotes. One from an article by Dr. Russell Humphreys on Answers in Genesis, and another from a relevant Wikipedia page. First, I will quote Dr. Humphreys. Quote, "The stars of our own galaxy, the Milky Way, rotate about the galactic center with different speeds, the inner ones rotating faster than the outer ones. The observed rotation speeds are so fast that if our galaxy were more than a few 100 million years old, it would be a featureless disk of stars instead of its present spiral shape. Yet, our galaxy is supposed to be at least 10 billion years old. Evolutionists call this the winding up dilemma, which they have known about for 50 years. They have devised many theories to try to explain it, each one failing after a brief period of popularity. The same winding up dilemma also applies to other galaxies. For the last few decades, the favored attempt to resolve the puzzle has been a complex theory called density waves." End quote. I think you can see what's going on here. Let's go to Wikipedia to find some information about this density wave theory. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Quote, "Density wave theory, or the Lin-Shu density wave theory, is a theory proposed by C.C. Lin and Frank Shu in the mid-1960s to explain the spiral arm structure of spiral galaxies." End quote. Okay, so it's a proposed theory. We can determine two things from this statement. First, we know that there is a problem, otherwise there would be no need for a theory. And second, if the density wave theory is still classified as a proposed theory, that means there is no evidence it is true. Because if there were evidence that it were true, it would be called the theory, or the explanation, as opposed to the proposed theory or the proposed explanation. Just because something's proposed doesn't mean it's true. Next, we will discuss the Earth's magnetic field. The Earth is surrounded by a magnetic field that protects the planets from solar radiation. However, it is observed that this magnetic field is decaying over time. With the current observed rate of decay, it is calculated that the lifespan of the magnetic field cannot be older than 20,000 years. This means that either the Earth is younger than 20,000 years, or there is some unobserved mechanism maintaining the existence of the magnetic field over the billions of years of Earth's existence. The biblical creation model is simply, God created the Earth's magnetic field as is 6,000 years ago, and it has simply been decaying since then. The secular scientists have to come up with something else. At this point, the secular scientists have something called the dynamo theory. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say about the dynamo theory. Quote, "In physics, the dynamo theory proposes a mechanism by which a celestial body such as the Earth or a star generates a magnetic field." End quote. So we have another proposed theory. Here's another quote. Quote, A dynamo is thought to be the source of Earth's magnetic field and the magnetic fields of Mercury and the Jovian planets. I guess they have another thought. Just because something is thought to be doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Also, there are observations that provide difficulties for this model, such as measured electric current in the seafloor and past magnetic field reversals. Another thing the secular scientists have a hard time explaining is the existence of the moon. Again, this is like the same song, 15th verse. The Big Bang model doesn't have a great explanation for how the moon can exist. So, over the past few decades, scientists have been coming up with theories. However, there is yet to be any evidence of these proposed theories, and they keep coming up with new ones. I have included in the sources the Wikipedia page on the origin of the moon. In this article, it does a good job of detailing what the theories have been over time. My first thought on this is, if your theory has a hard time explaining the existence of the moon, maybe it isn't a very good theory. Yet they still say, you can't believe the Bible because there is no evidence for it. We will shift gears now to cover two more relevant topics. We will now address distant starlight. Distant starlight is a common objection to the young Earth creation model. Basically, the argument goes like this. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. Light can only travel so fast. When talking about heavenly bodies, a commonly used measurement of distance is a light year. This simply is the distance that light can travel in a year. The furthest object ever observed from Earth is a galaxy 13 billion light years away. Theoretically, this would mean that it would take 13 billion years for the light to travel to Earth. An interesting note is, observing things in space is kind of like observing the past. We can't actually see what is happening right at this moment, because the light at this moment hasn't got here yet. We can only see the light coming from the past. So how does this work? Is the light that we see actually 13 billion years old? I guess you could call this a gap in the creation model as we know it. However, personally, I don't think it is. Right now, there are creation scientists attempting to come up with a scientific model in order to explain a young Earth and distant light. However, this is my personal opinion. I think that God supernaturally accelerated the speed of light to reach the Earth on creation week. I think this is a reasonable explanation because, for one, God can do miracles, and two, it is consistent with the other miracles performed during creation week. Genesis 1 says that God created plants and animals and humans within their respective 24-hour periods. This means that they were created either with accelerated growth or apparent age. So I think it is perfectly consistent with Genesis 1 to believe that when God created the bodies in the heavens, He accelerated the speed of light so that humans could see it on Earth. God is not bound by what we determine to be the laws of nature. Therefore, scientific models cannot explain miracles. Secular scientists laugh at Christians because they believe in miracles. That's not science, they say. We don't have any models for that, they say. Where is the evidence, they ask. Well, for one, it's not like we have any evidence for their miracles either. And apparently we're supposed to allow them to get away with saying, oh, we'll just discover that eventually. One thing that is interesting to think about is that we are often amazed by the beauty and complexity of the stars and other heavenly bodies in the universe. However, this awe-inspiring feature of creation is treated as an afterthought in Genesis 1. Genesis 1:16 reads, And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. It is estimated that there are 200 billion trillion stars in the universe. That is 2 times 10 to the 23rd power. And yet the Bible is like, oh yeah, God made those also. The focal point and pinnacle of creation is man, not the other things that God created. So yeah, the heavens do declare God's glory and handiwork. But yet, it is still man that He loves most, even though we are quite small compared to 200 billion trillion stars, if that number is even accurate. The last space thing I would like to talk about is the firmament. What in the world is the firmament? We read that word in Psalm 19:1, but it first appears in Genesis 1:6. Genesis 1:6 through 8 reads, And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. It is a little bit hard to visualize what's going on here. Some people like to say these verses are a reflection of the ancient Hebrew author's cosmological worldview that is now obviously discarded because of science. However, I don't think this is necessarily the case. I think these verses are consistent with what is observed today. In the King James Version, firmament is translated from the Hebrew word rakia. The tradition of using the word firmament comes from the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate. However, as I will get to in a few seconds, not all English Bible translations today use the word firmament for rakia. So the question is, what does the word firmament mean, and why is it there? Firmament essentially means a firm dome around the earth in the sky. We know now that something like that obviously doesn't exist. So why was that put into Bible translations? Well, the thing is, at the time of the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, the scientific theory at the time was that there actually was a firm dome around the earth. So we have to wonder that perhaps the modern scientific theory influenced the translators in their translation of this word. The scientific theory of that time has been discarded, but it still leaves a footprint in Bible translations today, and it does cause confusion. I think this shows that reading modern scientific theories into the Bible is a bad idea, because modern scientific theories are made by man and are fallible. So what the theistic evolutionists are doing today has already been done in the past. I think it is ironic that the King James Version shows us the folly of this behavior. Dr. Terry Mortensen has an article in the Answers Research Journal about what is actually going on in these verses. I will read some of the conclusions of the paper, and you can read the rest of it if you want. In the conclusion, he dismisses 3 common misconceptions. First, the rakia is not the atmosphere alone. Second, the rakia is not a hard shell covering the earth. And third, the waters above the rakia are not the clouds in the atmosphere. What the rakia, or firmament, actually is referring to both the atmosphere and the universe. The firmament was called heaven, and heaven is simply the expanse above us, both the atmosphere and outer space. In fact, the NASB 1995 actually uses the word expanse to translate rakia. The NASB 1995 translation of Genesis 1:6 is, "Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters.'" So if we remove secular influence from interpreting the Bible, like using the word firmament, we find that the Bible is actually accurate all along. Yes, there is an expanse called the heavens. So expanse is a more accurate translation of rakia, and it is more reflective of the original meaning. There are a couple other clues in Genesis 1 about what the firmament or expanse is. They show how we can determine that it is both outer space and the atmosphere. First, in Genesis 1:14, God creates the sun and moon in the firmament. So this would mean outer space. But then, in Genesis 20, God creates the birds to fly in the firmament. However, here in Genesis 20, it is worded just a little bit differently. It reads, "And fowl that they may fly above the open firmament of the heaven." What this phrase open firmament is likely referring to is the atmosphere, where the birds would fly. So therefore, firmament or expanse, according to the Bible, would mean both the atmosphere and the universe. Then the question is, what are the waters under the expanse, and what are the waters above the expanse? The waters under the expanse are the waters on earth. Then we get to the waters outside of the expanse. In the explanation I am giving, that would mean that there are waters outside of the universe. Could that be? It seems a little far-fetched, but I guess we've never been to the boundary of the universe to determine that there aren't waters there. Essentially then, there would be no human experience to verify what these waters outside of the expanse are. The best I can say is that, if the Bible says it, it is probably true, even if we don't understand it yet. So far, human experience only has 3 feeble clues to offer in understanding what these waters are. First, the idea that the universe has a boundary is debated. Obviously, we're not really sure. Second, Psalm 148:4 reads, "Praise him, ye heavens of heavens, and ye waters that be above the heavens." Apparently, then, another biblical author believed that there were waters above the heavens. Third, there is a study that detected water almost 13 billion light years away. So, at the very least, there is water about as far as we can see. Like I said, those clues were pretty feeble, but they kind of maybe point in the right direction, which the right direction would be the Bible is true. And with that leads us to the end of the episode on astronomy. I hope you found it informative. We will see you next time to talk about radiometric dating.